Hello and welcome to the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast, where I talk to experienced developers from different companies about how they develop software. I'm your host, Dr. Michaela, and today I have the pleasure to be talking to Dr. Leif Singer, who is a software engineer at Automattic. I'm really excited to have Leif here today to hear how his life is at a fully remote company. Leif is, like me, passionate about improving software engineering processes and tools. His specific interest is understanding how lightweight processes can help to collaborate better. He has a PhD in software engineering, but is also a science fiction writer and a musician. So I'm thrilled that Leif is here today. Leif, welcome. How are you?
Good morning, Michaela. Thanks for having me. I'm good, thanks.
I'm glad that you're here. So Leif, let's start at the beginning. We actually met when we both were working and living in, beautiful Victoria in Canada, precisely at the University of Victoria, where you worked as a postdoctoral researcher.
Yeah, right.
Now you live in Germany and work as an engineer, software engineer at Automattic. That's quite some change. So why did you change from academia to industry, and how did you start working at Automattic?
Wow, okay, you're starting with the tough questions. Interesting. So you know that, but not everyone might know that a postdoc position is a research position. It's at a university that is supposed to prepare you for the job hunt for a professorship, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I did the postdoc because I thought I wanted to become a professor. But when I worked as a postdoc with two supervisors who were themselves already professors, I realized that academia was, after all, not for me. The amount of time that I saw my superiors and my colleagues too put in far exceeded what I thought was reasonable. So they loved their jobs, so they worked on weekends and things like that, right? And I, as a father of a young family, I didn't see myself doing that regularly in the near future. And that was the first thing that crossed my mind. And then a few other things came together with us living in a different country, far away from home, with no support network of our own, with a small son. And in the end, we decided to cut the postdoc short at 1 year and move back home.
Okay, so it was actually supposed to go longer?
Yes, it was supposed to take 2 years, but I talked to my supervisor and she was all right with me cutting it short for 1 year.
Well, one of the things that you also addressed a little bit was like that you were living in a different country. And I also traveled and lived in different countries over the time, but I always had the feeling that I could choose it. But at the point that you want to become a professor, it's somehow out of your hands a little bit. It's
Yes.
not like you can say, well, I want to become a professor in Germany. That's really a very difficult
Right, you
task
can't be
to...
choosy at that point.
Yeah.
You have to just move where the jobs are. Yeah, and that was definitely part of our decision.
I totally understand that. So then you made this decision, and what happened next? What was the next thing that you went on to do after your postdoc?
I didn't have a plan, so I looked for a job. And I found a remote job at a small company called I Done This.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a small app. When I joined, it was me and 4 others who worked on that app. It was really small, based mostly in New York. I worked there for, I suppose, 1.5 or 2 years almost, when the founders at some point decided that they want to sell the company. And that's when I started looking for a new job, because the buyers didn't want to buy the team, only the product and the customer base.
It's a bummer, probably, if you put part of your heart in there.
Yes, definitely. It was a bummer. But in the end, it turned out that Automattic were some of our customers. So I got an intro from our CEO to one of Automattic's, basically the person who managed the Automattic account.
Okay, well, that's good.
Yeah, and that's how I even thought about applying at Automattic and how I found about this company. So in the end, it turned out to be a nice circumstance.
So when you were interviewing then for Automattic, did you have like the skill set that was needed for that position, or did you have to adjust there?
So Automattic is the company behind WordPress.com. And as such, I would have assumed that you need to know PHP and WordPress development. I had not developed a single WordPress plugin or theme before applying. I did have a few years of experience with PHP when I was doing my bachelor's at university. I basically worked on the side as a PHP freelancer. But when I went through my trial at Automattic, you go through a trial over the course of 1 or 2 months where you work on basically a real project. I worked on a React app that was not released at that time. It has now been released as the front end, or well, the administrative backend for WordPress.com. So pretty much a replacement for the WP admin part of things, written in React.js with Redux, server-side rendered with Node, lots of buzzwords in there. And I had never heard of anything from those technologies before I started working on that. But that was also part of the process, I believe, of the trial process, to see how I learn, how I adjust to new technologies and things like that, what kind of questions I ask.
Okay, that's really interesting. So you start with this, maybe let us look a little bit at this trial, because I think it's very specific to Automattic, how they hire, right?
Sure.
But once you explain that, maybe look at that you actually started that without prior knowledge of the technology. I think that's really mind-blowing somehow. I really like that concept. But yeah, it can be frightening, I can imagine.
It really was. And actually, I don't think it's that common. So I can see some of what current trials are working on, and it's much more matched to their skill set. So I suppose I got lucky in an earlier time of the company where that was possible. Right now, I think we are trying to standardize a bit because we really need to scale up hiring. And that is much easier when you have one approach that works.
So how does such a trial look like at Automatics right now? If I want to have a job at Automatics, what do I have to do?
Right. So at first you send an email, or it might have changed actually. Maybe you fill out a form. We're starting to use a tool for managing those applications as well. Anyway, you write in with your CV and a cover letter, and at some point, hopefully soon, you hear back with hopefully a yes, we'd be interested. And then you do an interview over text. So I believe we use Slack nowadays. You get invited as
it's like
Slack.
a chat?
Yes, it's a text chat. And you basically talk for, I guess, about an hour where you're being asked about your career, about some technical things. So it's basically a screener where we try to figure out whether it would be a good match, thinking-wise, technology-wise, things like that. If that chat works out well, you get invited to do a small project that should take, I don't know the actual times right now, but I think it's about 4 or 5 hours that you need to put in over a week, where you get a small piece of code that you are supposed to improve with specific instructions. Hey, is this code secure? What if we add this and that feature? Could you do that? Things like that. And I think we call that a code test. But if that works out also, then you get to do a trial, which can take anywhere from 1 month to 2 months. Some have also taken longer. You get assigned a real project that we really want to use. And sometimes you're part of an actual team. You get to know a few of your possible future colleagues. And we basically look at how you write code, how you communicate, how you react in the face of challenges, how you scope things like that. We feel it's a very wholesome picture that we get of the applicant. It is paid at a flat rate of $25 per hour for everyone. It's no indication of your future pay, but it's the same pay for every role during that trial. A trial should be doable while putting in 5 to 20 hours per week, I suppose. I think I put in about 10 hours per week, which can be a challenge if you're working and maybe you have children. We try to accommodate as many people as possible.
That sounds interesting. So I'm working alongside the team that I will probably work afterwards?
Well, maybe. That's not definitive.
Okay.
But you will work with other automaticians or Automattic employees.
And then I will do daily tasks that are needed for a position actually at that team, right? So I really
Yes,
do
exactly.
what they would expect me to do.
Yes, and you will write code that, if it works out well, will probably be used in production.
Yeah, I see. Well, I actually throw you a little bit in the deep end, right, with the whole hiring processes and things like that, as that's actually not your role. But I think it's always interesting to see different ways of entering a company. And
yeah, I agree. And it's one of the more interesting parts of the company where you can see how it scales.
yeah, because it's very different, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, coming back to software engineering at Automattic. So you talked about React and Node.js and things like that. What is the tech stack? So if I want to apply there, what do I have to bring to the table to be able to apply?
It depends on the role, of course. There's different skill descriptions and the different job postings. But generally, for code, it would help if you knew PHP, WordPress, JavaScript, React, and yeah, pretty much that. But around that, there's always ecosystems of other technologies, adjacent technologies that will also be helpful or useful for you to know, right? So, for example, one project is based on GitHub and it's written in React.js. It's a huge app, uses Redux as a store, and we have proper continuous integration there. We have unit tests and integration tests and end-to-end tests and whatnot. And then another project uses Subversion and PHP and WordPress, and that's pretty much it. That's all the technologies you have available to you. So it can differ or it can vary a lot. So it helps if you come to it with a certain generalist attitude, I think. And if you can learn, then I think you already have the most important skill.
So what you're saying is also that you're maybe moving within the company. So if let's say I start at the Git project that you just mentioned, and then it could be that I'm actually moved or I want to move. I don't know what exactly
Right.
happens, but to different
Right.
projects.
So I started out working on the React app, which was very interesting with all those new technologies and everything, right? Using Git is always a very pleasurable experience, and that is without sarcasm. But at some point, I wanted a change of scenery. I wanted to learn other things that I had not learned about before. So right now, how that works usually is you just send a private message to Matt and tell him, hey, I'm looking to change teams. I'm interested in these and these things. Can you take a look? And then after a couple of days, he gets back to you and tells you that, sure, we might have a position open in this team. What do you think? And that's how you start the process of switching a team internally. So now I work on the marketing team because I thought that being a developer and knowing something about marketing, that sounds like a superpower combination, you know, like knowing how to market a product that you can also build.
Yeah,
So
true.
right now I'm really in the depths of that, specializing a bit now. I'm a project lead for affiliates and partnerships where we basically give people a commission if they refer customers to us. So that's what I've been doing in the past months, I guess.
I really find it an interesting approach that you send an email to, well, the CEO.
It's not an email. We don't use email pretty much.
Okay,
So I sent,
okay.
it's a Slack DM, a Slack message.
And then he probably asks around for you or talks with leadership somewhere else,
Mm-hmm.
and you figure out where and how that could be.
Exactly. And he also talks to the hiring team because those are the people who naturally need to have good understanding of the open roles that we need to fill.
I guess that this process looks so different from other companies because you're a fully remote company, right? So you cannot bump into somebody at the water cooler and tell them, oh, actually, I'm a little bit interested in changing teams or something.
Well, you can do that too. So when you've worked on a few teams, you will know a few people around the company who are maybe not in your current team. So So you can also use those connections to figure out where there could be a good match for a new team.
But how do you keep contact with those people? Do you use Slack for that, or do you sometimes hang out somewhere in the cyberspace together?
So we use Slack for the more synchronous communication needs. Most teams have weekly calls. Most people will have a weekly one-on-one call with their lead, and those would usually be video calls. We do have a company-wide town hall once a month where Matt basically hosts a huge call and talks about what's going on in the company this month. And everyone can join from the 900 plus people. Everyone can join that one call and ask questions through Slack. It would be pretty messy, I suppose, if everyone was talking. And then we have WordPress, of course. We use a specific or a special theme called P2 that we use for project and team blogs. So every team and every project or larger projects will have their own blog where we can post updates, questions, specifications, document communications with outside vendors and stuff like that. And that is pretty much all we use for communicating with each other. We do not use email at all.
Wow, that's so different to my experience at Microsoft, where, well, we are fueled by emails, right?
Mm-hmm. So another big part of how we get to know each other and how we build up trust is meeting in person from time to time. So every team meets about 2 times per year. And once a year, the whole company meets in one single place where we have 1 week of meeting each other, working on projects, learning things together, stuff like that.
Yeah, that sounds really good, because otherwise, if you have never seen that person ever.
Yeah. And it's also, to be honest, it's a big perk of the company too, that you get to travel like 2 or 3 times to interesting places.
Yeah, I always see your Instagram pictures, Dan, where you say like, what was New Orleans or something was the last time? No.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
New Orleans, right? Yeah, and I thought, like, wow, that's amazing. I would
Yeah, it
like
was
to
really
be
nice.
there as well. Yeah. So when you look at your company, is there something very specific going on for the processes and tools that you use for the normal software development? Well, really writing the code, building the code, deploying the code, testing, something like that. Is there something that you think is different from other companies? And how does it look like in general?
I don't know about other companies that much, but I can say that because we have a bunch of different products and they are all technologically somewhat different, the approaches we use so for continuous integration and for version control, for example, they can differ like by decades. So WordPress is on Subversion, right? And
Mm-hmm.
we have a WordPress repo that we need to merge with the WordPress core project from time to time, or we have to merge the open source project into our repo from time to time, right? And it also has our own modifications to it. So that project is on Subversion and there is no GitHub for Subversion, right? The best
Mm-hmm.
or the next best thing that comes close to that would be Fabricator, which is kind of like an interface on top of Subversion repos where you can also do things like pull requests and getting reviews on those and stuff like that. And that system itself is also, again, we don't use Circle CI or Travis CI or things like that on that repo because those systems assume a Git-based repository. So we use something that's called Team City on that. So basically, the parts are all the same theoretically, but in their manifestation, they differ. Like they will use different technologies. So we do use version control. We do use code reviews. We do use continuous integration, rewrite tests, all those things. But how we do that and how hard it is also will differ from project to project.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, how big is Automattic? Can you remind me again?
So the company is,
For
that's just
yeah,
900 people.
900 people. Okay. And
Yes.
how many engineers do you know?
It's a rough estimate, I think. Like, I don't know if I recall exactly, but maybe about 400.
Okay. So for 400 people, I think it's quite diverse, right? I mean, you're dealing with all those different technologies, you're dealing with
Mm-hmm.
all those different tools. So also the knowledge that you have to know all of those really in and out is quite scattered, right? Is there some future goal of consolidating those different technologies? So like, for example, porting the WordPress code base to Git? Or is that just too huge thing to do?
I think that's a politically very heavy subject.
Okay.
Because we depend on the WordPress open source project, right? And it's an open source project. We don't get to dictate what they use, right? Or so we have a whole team who basically gets paid to work on the open source project, but they are trying really hard not to let company decisions or influences let that influence their open source work, right?
Yeah.
So we really depend on the open source project for that. So if the open source project moves to Git, we can move over too.
Yeah, I see. Okay, yeah, I never thought about it. I mean, that's really an interesting aspect as well of working at Automattic, that you have like this, I call it now tension a little bit, but also,
it is.
tension between open source and the commercial interests of a company, right?
Yeah.
What are the benefits that that the company gets out of open sourcing parts of their software? Why do you do that?
We're an open source company. The company is founded on the idea of open source, basically, right? So we embrace it. And I'm not sure if it's really about the concrete advantages of open source, but I think culturally, this spirit of openness, of transparency, that's helpful in other areas too. For example, if all the communication is transparent and if decisions are transparent, that creates a vastly different company culture. And that might not directly affect code or things like that, right? But it will affect many other things.
Yeah, and actually, I have to say that when I asked you to be on my podcast, it was quite a quick decision, right? You just send an email, or well, it was not an email, a message, right, to one of your colleagues, and they approved it. And I know that for several other interview participants, it's like a week's going on process for them to get, well, allowance to even talk, and some of them are just purely denied. It's like, no, you cannot talk on a podcast.
So we have a Slack channel called PR for public relations, where people talk about things like that. And I just asked a question there. And by coincidence, the colleague who replied to my question was Matt.
Okay.
So I got an official okay from the CEO.
Oh yeah, now I feel really at ease. Now I can ask all these tricky questions.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, very cool. Yeah, well, that's really something. I mean, it's a minor peek into your company, but for me, it was very, well, relieving also. I ask you to ask for permission, and you ask for permission, and within a few minutes, you're coming back and saying, "Yes, I can talk on your podcast," and that's so nice, right?
I mean, we do have some back and forth too. We don't always have transparency, even if we want it, but the default is transparency, openness, low bureaucracy. So we'll never reach the ideal, but we're always trying to approximate it, right? So one guideline that Matt keeps on mentioning is to quickly make decisions that are easily reversible. You know, like don't fret too much over making a decision that you can reverse within a matter of minutes anyway.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, that's really smart. So that's a lot about culture, right? How the culture of a company works. And well, how long have you been now at Automattic?
Oh, I joined 3.5 years ago.
Okay. So do you feel that the culture, I mean, the company evolved and grew quite substantially? Did the
Yes, very
culture also
much.
change much during that time, or did it stay the same?
Both, I think.
Okay.
So I think when I joined, we were about 300 people. Now we're over 900. So it has tripled in size within 3 years. It would be pretty weird if that would not create friction, I suppose, especially with people coming in who might have worked in other contexts, who might be further removed from the open source project, for example. They will carry a different cultural inventory with them, I believe. So it's a constant balance that we're trying to strike between letting more diverse perspectives in, but staying true to the core of the company values. One thing that helps with that is that we have a creed, the Automattic creed.
Okay, what's that?
So if you go to automattic.com/creed, CREED, you will see a short text, which is something like the vision for the culture of the company in a nutshell. And I'm going to read it to you. And the Automattic Creed says, I will never stop learning. I won't just work on things that are assigned to me. I know there's no such thing as a status quo. I will build our business sustainably through passionate and loyal customers. I will never pass up an opportunity to help out a colleague, and I'll remember the days before I knew everything. I am more motivated by impact than money, and I know that open source is one of the most powerful ideas of our generation. I will communicate as much as possible because it's the oxygen of a distributed company. I'm in a marathon, not a sprint, and no matter how far away the goal is, the only way to get there is by putting one foot in front of another every day. Given time, there is no problem that's insurmountable. And that's the Automattic Creed. And that is basically the gospel that we try to reference when we need to make decisions that we're not sure whether they align with company goals, company culture, our values, and things like that. And usually it at least gives us a rough direction to turn to.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. It sounds like a person spent a lot of time really thinking about the values of a company. Yeah, that's nice. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit now and talk with you about the software engineering processes. So do you have similar guidelines like the Automattic Creed for your development processes? And how do you do things? Like, for example, how do you test your system?
So non-end-to-end tests. So all the tests that don't need a browser to run, I would say, the developers write themselves as part of their ongoing work. But for end-to-end tests, where we use like a headless browser to actually use the site and buy things and sign up, for that we do have a specific team who works on that, just because it's a very specific niche technology and you have to develop a very deep expertise to be able to automate all that and to know how to handle issues. For example, if you try to buy something and the test fails, why is that? Is that because maybe the payments provider was down, or is it a problem in your code? And if you have many dependencies to other services, then it can become pretty hairy pretty quickly. So it's nice to have a specific team for that.
Okay. And do you have like something like code coverage? Do you track that? Is this something that's part of your daily basis or not?
No, I don't think we do that. No. I think we did discuss measuring something like code coverage at some point, but then I think we didn't want to focus too much on a single metric.
Mm-hmm.
So we did experiment around that a bit. And I think what we ended up with is an integration on GitHub that posts a message to your PR if the code that you add has a code coverage lower than something like that.
Okay.
Something not too obnoxious, something kind of subtle.
And now that you said, well, the whole landscape is very diverse, technology-wise, but also tool-wise, is that also something that's different for each of the teams and projects that you work on, or is there some standard policy around testing, code reviews, things like that?
We don't have a standard policy written out anywhere, I think. We do have guidelines so we do have a company handbook, so to say. It's called the Field Guide. It's just another blog. Everyone can edit it. And you can find out pretty much anything you need to know about working here by looking into it.
Mm-hmm.
And it does have a few guidelines for how to test projects, how much effort to put into it, so you don't get derailed. But there's no hard written rules, I would say. So usually you would look at the product that you're working on and figure out what the testing culture is on that product, and then basically blend in, be normal, right, in that project.
Okay. But it can differ from project to project.
Yes, I
how
would say
people
that.
do stuff. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, especially because it's just very different technologies, right?
Okay. So it's sort of technology-driven alignments.
Technology influenced, I would say, yeah. And
Okay.
also,
Mm-hmm.
different products are obviously of different importance, right? So that will play into that as well, I would say. So WordPress.com has, I don't know if I can say the number, but it's a lots of users, and it would be really bad if it would break. So that would have different standards than, say, an internal app that we're developing for just for comfort reasons or something.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what about code reviews? And one of my topics that I worked a lot on was code reviews and how they are used to improve the code quality, but also to share knowledge amongst developers. Is code review something that you do at Automatics, and how are people perceiving it?
I think it's changed over time. So when I joined, there were still a few people who would just cowboy code and commit, but that is getting fewer and fewer. It's been probably 2 years or something like that since I've seen anyone commit without a review. So every pull request, or whatever you may call it, every change will have been looked at by at least one other colleague. If it's very sensitive stuff like, for example, payments code, then we would have 2 or 3 other colleagues look at it, depending on at what level we would feel comfortable. And we'd also reach out to experts on the subject matter if we are not experts ourselves. So that's, yeah, I think that's really nice how it works. I feel very happy with having everything reviewed.
This gives you a good feeling about your own code and about the code from others.
Yeah, and generally, I think it makes for a good environment where we all know about our own fallibility. Like, we all know that this is an obvious fix, were famous last words, right? Like, it's very hard if you work on something to really, really, really be sure that this doesn't break anything, because you don't know everything, right? And again, going back to the creed, I remember the days before I knew everything. So this sort of humility is kind of built into the company culture. So most people are very thankful for others to look at their code.
Yeah, that sounds great. Especially for code reviews, one of the pitfalls or problems with it is that you wait very long for other people to look at your code. And I can imagine at a distributed company, well, remote and distributed company with different time zones, that can be painful. How do you mitigate that?
So many teams use Trello to basically move cards through backlog, this week, in progress, in review, and done, something like that. And those changes will be posted to the team's Slack channels. So if I see a colleague move something into a review column on Slack, then I'll know this is ready for review. I will usually not get to it immediately, but if it has some time pressure behind it, then the colleague will reach out to me and ask me, hey, do you have a minute today to take a look at this? I would really like to deploy this today because that would really benefit our customers in X and Y. But there are also, of course, reviews that are neither important nor urgent, but we still want to review that code, right? So we do have it's a Slack app. We call it the stick. And the stick, so I think it comes from being beaten with a stick. So it's like, it's a nudge, it nudges you to review. So it has like a config file where you can set up your teams and those teams Trello boards. So it continuously or once a day, it looks at your team's Trello board, looks at all the cards that are in the review column, and then randomly pings people on Slack, hey, Leif, what about reviewing this one today, right? So you get actual pings on Slack by the stick. And depending on the person, I think very few people ignore it, because a ping on Slack is kind of like,
Well, it's a stick.
yeah, it's a thing you kind of should be doing.
Okay.
Yeah, and that really helps keep that needs review column clean.
Okay. So one thing that I wanted to ask you as well is, well, if you have this review step, but then how far are actually developers away from production? What I mean by that is, well, imagine you're making a new feature or a bug fix or whatever. What steps are in between you saying, well, my code is done, and having it in production? How much steps are in between which steps, and maybe a roughly estimate of a time if you can give it?
So again, the specifics will depend on the project that you're working on because of the different technologies, but roughly if you have something that has been reviewed, right? So you're confident that a sufficient number of reviewers have told you that this can be deployed, then you merge it and you deploy it. We have a command to deploy the latest master branch basically to production, and that's it.
Okay, so you're quite quickly there, and that's then really in production, or is there some staging happening before, or?
We do have a staging for at least one of the projects where we can try things out with the proper host names and everything, and with actual production data, but that's like only a last check. So we would spend maybe 10 minutes clicking around a bit there to see if really everything's really all right. But usually our development environments and our testing environments are close enough to production for us to be relatively sure that things will work the same.
And what about these testers that you said, all of those tests are automatic tests, the really end-to-end test? And those you would run before deploying to production as well? Is that?
Yeah, they get run automatically for every pull request. So if you create a pull request that has a label needs review, then that will automatically run all the end-to-end tests on it.
Cool. And what about technical debt? I mean, that's a topic that's discussed hotly, and I think it's a very fussy term as well, but I would like to talk with you about it. What role has technical debt in or at Automattic, and how do you handle it? How do you assess it on a daily basis?
Right. I mean, we definitely do have technical debt. That's like, there's no way around that. Mostly because we try to move fast, and we try to work only on the things that we really want to accomplish. And that can be an aspect where, for example, future maintainability can become more difficult because you're trying to optimize for shipping customer value, right? Once a quarter, we do have a week where basically every developer works on things like that, either technical debt or also things like UX debt, like where flows don't match with each other, but it's not a priority for any team, so it kind of lingers in there. But once a quarter, we have this week where we address things like that, and over the weeks, we collect tasks that we think would be a good idea for such a week, and during the week, we will then have like a pile of tech debt or UX debt tasks that we can work on. Actually, we are in such a week right now.
So then that's your main focus or your sole focus?
Yeah, pretty much the sole focus. I mean, the things, the lights need to be kept on, obviously, so you cannot 100% focus on that usually, but it's a large part of my day. If I'm not on a podcast talking,
Yeah.
then I would usually try to work on those tasks just to, when the whole company tries to address tech debt and UX debt once a quarter for a whole week. That means you get a nice cadence into it. You get into a rhythm where things aren't perfect at any one time, but they continuously get better step by step, you know? And I think that's how we try to address it. And then we can refactor things while we work on it, right? So we try to build that kind of maintenance into our daily work also. But it's not our sole focus, right? Like we try to optimize for shipping customer value.
Yeah. Yeah, I like the really scheduled and planned approach as well, because otherwise people tend to work on things that are just more impactful, or that they, like to work on shipping features somehow always feels probably more urgent or more fun as well. So it's sort of bookkeeping, right? So when tax season ends, you somehow have to do your taxes, right? So if there wouldn't be a deadline, probably nobody would do them.
Yeah. Or documentation. I recently saw a talk where she discussed the incentives around writing documentation. And she said that nobody ever got fired for not writing documentation, and nobody ever got promoted for writing documentation, which is probably roughly true. So what incentive is there to do these things, right? But if you see the whole company turn towards this one goal for a whole week, then again, you want to behave as most people do. So, okay, let's look at tech debt this week.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I also like that pick up the topic about promotion. So how do you think you're assessed? Is there a formal process for it? Do you know how people assess you, what they look for? How do you get promoted? What's the life there
Right.
at Automattic?
So what's a promotion? So when you like a change in title or a change in responsibility?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, maybe, I don't know. Very often I think is change in title. Yeah, better compensation for what you do.
So compensation is reviewed once a year. Automatically, you don't have to do anything. And basically, it takes into account the week you did the year before. And depending on how impactful you were, on how much value you shipped to customers, basically, your salary will get adjusted by more or by less. You'll never get a reduction. You'll always get a slight increase just to account for inflation. But that's all there is to compensation at Automatic.
But how would you assess the quality that you shipped or the value
Right.
that you shipped to customers? I mean, it's not that easy to measure, I imagine.
No, sure. So regularly, your team lead will get a request for feedback, and you will like try to document everything that you saw about your report and report that in that request for feedback. And the employee themselves will also get such a feedback request for self-feedback. And they can also give feedback on their lead. So, and it can be anonymous if you want to. Like you don't have to, like you can decide to share that feedback with a person, but you don't have to. And that's how we get a constant stream of feedback about people. But on the formal side and on the career track side, we don't have any titles really. We can choose our own titles. Let me quickly look that up. Matt Mullenweg. If I look that up in the employee directory, his title is CBBQTT, which stands for Chief Barbecue Taster, I think, something like that.
Okay.
So it can be very random, it can be fun, but it can also be very matter of fact. So some people will say senior developer, and that's what they are.
Mm-hmm.
So role or responsibility isn't tied closely to compensation. So if you become a team lead, that we try to not consider that a promotion. There will be no change in compensation if you change your role. The incentives are designed in a way to optimize for people who really want to do the things that the role requires. So if you become a lead and your salary doesn't change, it's suddenly much easier to say,
I don't want
oh, wait,
yeah,
this is really annoying. Like I've given this a shot for a year. Actually, I like writing code better. And there will be no change in compensation. So you can do that. So and that way we try to keep the people in the lead roles and the management roles who really like the management work, right? At a traditional company, you would, I don't know, get like a pay bump once you're like a manager, and then you adjust to the new lifestyle and you can't go back. And suddenly you're stuck with this role. And that's something we try to guard against that.
Okay, yeah, I see that. And so you said at the beginning, you said that you're striving for a lot of transparency and things like that. Is that also reflected, for example, in this? I mean, especially if you don't have those titles, I think on one hand it's really good because it takes away those things. On the other hand, it's a little bit less transparent, right?
It's definitely a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, also just people coming in, and it's not something that we advertise. Warning, we have no career titles here, right? And that's something you definitely have to grow into. But to me, it is somewhat freeing, to realize that you don't have to follow this career ladder that someone somewhere designed at some point, but that you can basically make your own adventure, right? And grow in ways that you think are interesting for you at this moment in time. It is a huge adjustment, but so if you're still here or if you're still at Automattic after 2 years, you will probably have adjusted to this way. And if not, then you might think about leaving because, I don't know, you crave a career progression more, titles more. Maybe you're a very title-oriented person then that would maybe not be a good fit because everyone should choose a random title.
Yeah, I can see how that fits into the Automattic culture and the idea of being humble. Well, one thing that I wanted to talk with you about, and that I think fits a little bit into that topic as well, is diversity. How diverse is especially the technical workforce at Automattic?
So the tech industry in general is basically white dudes, right? And we are mostly that too. It's something we are trying to actively address by being more present at events where a more diverse audience might be present. We try to reach out proactively a bit more. We try to make ourselves available. We try to remove our own biases when hiring by, for example, when we decide to hire a person, we have not had a video chat with them. Like, so you can go through the whole process before anyone sees your face. For example, we also do have an internal diversity and inclusion committee that meets regularly and tries to take care of where the whole company is headed with regards to that. But it's not solved, right? Like it's very obviously still a problem, and that's the case for us too. We're all very aware of it. And for example, the developer hiring is 50% or more than 50% females. And that is really nice. Like, so the people who can make the decisions, the people who will impact what kind of people will join, they're already at about 50%, I believe. And I think that's a pretty good sign to have. Like, they're kind of like the gatekeepers, right? Even though they try to be impartial and reduce their own biases, they are the gatekeepers. And it's nice to know that there is a larger number of perspectives on that team than there has been traditionally,
So yeah, I can really see how that can impact the hiring decisions, and I think it's a really good step forward. I wanted to thank you, Leif, for this awesome interview.
My pleasure.
It was, I think, very well rounded. We covered a lot of topics.
Yeah,
what do you think?
That was very nice.
So thank you for being on my show and letting me know so much about your work live at Automattic.
Yes, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Leif.
Talk soon. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed another episode of the Software Engineering Unlocked podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Bye.